So we're going to have a go at a 16 marker from a Nazi Germany June 2020 paper. 16 marker is often where a lot of students lose a lot of marks because they don't, especially on this paper, because they don't use the interpretations properly. So this question is, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the extent of support for the Nazi regime in the years 1933 to 39? So the question always will be 3D. Now the reason it's 3D is because 3A, 3B and 3C all link to this question. So if you've answered those, it already gives you that head start when answering this. It asks you, how far do you agree? So already it's asking you to make a judgment. It's then asking you, how far do you agree with interpretation 2? So rather than giving you a factor, it's saying, well, do you agree with this person's view on this event in history? Okay, that's the only difference. Rather than giving you the factor, it's asking you to look at interpretation 2 and tell them what that argument is. So you need to look back at your previous answers to help you with this. And it's about the extent of support for the Nazi regime. Now, if you've already done those previous questions, it makes it a lot easier. So for that one, you want to look back at 3B, where it asks you, what is the main difference between these views? Because you will already have picked out what the view of interpretation 1 is and what in view of interpretation 2 is. So if we look at this question and these interpretation, it says interpretation 1 states that there was a lack of support for the Nazi regime. It says many Germans did not conform with the Nazi regime. Whereas interpretation 2 argues there was a lot of support for the Nazi regime. It says German people clearly conformed. So we know our argument is going to be there was a lot of support, and that's what we're going to use here. So interpretation 2 states there was a lot of support, and it's worth writing that at the top of your answer so that you know what the argument is. So essentially it rewords the question, how far do you agree that there was a lot of support for the Nazi regime in the years 1933 to 39? That's it. Now let's have a look at those interpretations. So, even though it's only asking us about interpretation 2, we still need to make sure we include information about interpretation 1. Otherwise we're going to get capped and we're not able to make a judgment because we've just based it on one interpretation. So we need to look at both. Okay, so the way you start this answer, you'll have read these and you'll have a good understanding of the interpretations before, so that should already help you. And it's about the structure for this one and how to utilise those interpretations. So the first thing we do is we decide how far we agree with interpretation 2. And the way that you can do that is quite simply state, I agree or disagree to and I'm going to say a large extent, with interpretation 2. So I've made my judgment, but what I need to do is now state what interpretation's view is. I agree to a large extent with interpretation 2 that there was a lot of support for the Nazi regime in the years 1933 to 39. Again, wording of the question for clarity. So I agree to a large extent with interpretation 2 that there was a lot of support for the Nazi regime in the years 1933 to 39. That's the foundational bit you need to show that you've made a judgment and you know what interpretation 2's view is about. What is also useful to do in your introduction is to state about interpretation 1. So you might want to say it is also important to analyse interpretation 1 which argues that there was not a lot of support for the Nazis. Now, the reason that you want to mention interpretation 1 there is so that if you do run out of time when you're writing your answer, the examiner can see, okay, this person has intended to look at this and has intended to write about the second interpretation, which could mean your marks potentially could get a little bit higher because you have mentioned it. And that's all you need for your introduction. Now, your first paragraph, you want to focus on the interpretation in the question, because if you ignore that, you're ignoring the question. So we're going to start with interpretation 2, and then we'll go to interpretation 1, and then back to interpretation 2. There's lots of different ways you can structure this answer. So you might choose, so for example, you might choose to do it where you go interpretation 1, and then interpretation 2, interpretation 2, to make your argument stronger, or you might choose to go back and forth. It doesn't matter which way you do it, as long as you mention both interpretations, because you want to make sure your argument is the strongest. So actually, we'll start with interpretation 1 to make sure the argument is the strongest. So we might say, interpretation 1 states that, and this is where you want to quote. It's really, really important that you quote it if you're using it from interpretation, so that the examiner knows you're utilising those interpretations. It's from their knowledge and it's not your own. It states that many Germans did not conform with the Nazi regime, implying people did not support the Nazi Party. So we've got a bit of information there, and we might want to include some other bits. People protested against Nazi control, because that's own knowledge that we can then bring in. It argues that people protested against Nazi control. So we've quoted. We've indicated that this shows there's not a lot of support. Now what we need to do is show, well, what knowledge do we have that backs this up? So we can say, during this time, there were several opposition groups to the Nazis, such as the White Rose group. So try and name drop if you can. The Swing Youth, and Edelweiss Pirates. They did not approve of Nazi policies towards the young, and outwardly protested through pamphlet distribution or engaging with band activities such as listening to jazz music. So that's our own knowledge. The more specific you can get, the better, but it's about arguing and supporting that interpretation. So this highlights lack of support, as it clearly indicates, and we can even do an embedded quote if you want, that people did not fully support the Nazis. So we've quoted from interpretation 1. So we've got our own knowledge, and we've explained kind of why that shows support the Nazis, because, so even I forgot there, because, so making sure we justify. This shows that people do not fully support the Nazis because they were openly and actively going against Nazi ideals. Now, what we want to then do is try and analyse that interpretation a little bit more. And actually say that these groups potentially weren't that big, and therefore they didn't have as much as an impact. So you are allowed to argue against the interpretation, and you're allowed to break it down. So I might say, however, the people engaging in these activities were of a minority and therefore did not have a large impact on the Nazi regime. We can then link back to suggesting that the vast majority did support the Nazis, and this will link nicely to our interpretation too. The large amount of support for the Nazis can be seen in interpretation 2. Interpretation 2 states that the party gained 4 million new members. This clearly indicates people supported the Nazis as they have actively made a decision to join the party. we know, so we're going to do our own knowledge now, we know that Hitler appealed to the masses, such as large factory owners, by saying that he would stop them falling to communism, and appealed to a lot of the middle class by arguing they would reverse the Treaty of Versailles. Thus the Nazis were able to gain all those new members and found it easy, so again, embedding that quote if you need to, easy to support the Nazi dictatorship. So we've again argued, we've looked at interpretation 2 now. Now if this is all I wrote, what I'd need to do if I was running out of time is I'd have to do a quick conclusion at the bottom, and that should be okay to still give you those basic marks. But what you want to do is you want to do an introduction, 1 paragraph on one interpretation, 2 paragraphs on the other interpretation, and then a conclusion, so that you've got a really consolidated answer. And then we're going to link it back to the question. This shows there was significant support for the Nazis. Now we can look at interpretation again in more depth, because interpretation 2, if we look at it, it just focuses on people joining the party. It doesn't say why, but we've been able to establish why with our own knowledge. But we could also argue against this, found it easy to support the Nazi party, arguably because they didn't necessarily have a choice and that conformity was, well, forced. So we can say, however, interpretation 2 fails to consider that this easy support could have been forced onto the people, so they had to conform and support the Nazis through fear of secret police and punishment for going against them. So although this is not said in the interpretation, we're using our knowledge to say, well, actually, yes, they're right, loads of people conformed, but they didn't always have a choice, and that's what we can argue. Therefore, support for the Nazis might not have been a choice Now we can then go on to our conclusion. To conclude, it is clear from interpretation 1 that some did not support the Nazi Party. However, interpretation 2 is more convincing, and therefore I agree to a large extent that even if it was forced support, the vast majority of people supported the Nazi regime. So what I've done in my conclusion is I've done a summary of what interpretation 1 is, but I've said, well, actually no, interpretation 2 is more convincing, and then I've reiterated what I said in my introduction, that I agree to a large extent that the vast majority of people supported the Nazi regime. Now, obviously this is not the strongest answer because we've just written it off the top of our head in the time frame, but it does everything that it needs to get you into those top bands. So don't worry too much about thinking about your kind of academic language and making it flowery. Get to the point. Use spelling correctly, because there is spag on this one. So try and spell things correctly. Make sure you're using grammar, capital letters, full stops, the basics, so you can get at least 2 marks. But make it straight to the point so the examiner knows exactly what you're writing about, and then it's a lot easier for them to mark, and easy to get you into those higher bands. And that's how you do a 16 marker for the interpretations paper 3.